Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Jesmond Calleja, and I'm the Collection Systems Manager at VUG, New South Wales. And my pronouns are he, him, and his. So I'd like to welcome you all to day 3 of our Vernon User Group meeting this morning to a very important session called Querying the Database, LGBTQ plus representations in collections. And I'd like to firstly thank VUG New South Wales, and in particular Vernon Systems, for giving me this opportunity to be able to chair this very important session. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am speaking on the beautiful country that is Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. Our First Nations people are a continuing living culture who first colonised this country by about 60,000 years ago. They have left and continue to leave their footprints throughout this land in the abundance of all the archaeological evidence and the superb rock art that is scattered around this vast country. I pay my respects to the past, present, and emerging generations and elders. This country always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The stories and histories of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transsexual people have historically been hidden stories, suppressed and remained in the closet for many years. Evidence has all been too actively suppressed or destroyed, leading to false interpretations that these histories have never existed, or its impact on society is limited to the very recent past. We know that's continually wrong. Museums around the world have been collecting and exhibiting objects relating to the LGBTQ community. The only case is that in historical times, this term never existed. And furthermore, and we know through the vast amount of archaeological evidence that homosexuality and related themes have always been identified. So I guess this brings me to the question of how are institutions recording these objects? How are gay representations, gender identity, events, and associated recording in the database? And what data is being captured in our database? And what can statistics reveal to us? That now takes me to the speakers for today's session. So starting off today, we have David Reeves. So David is the Director in Collections and Research at the Auckland Museum. David joined the museum in 2011 after a time in Wellington at the Alexandra Turnbull Library as Associate Chief Librarian. David's career also includes roles at the Auckland Art Gallery as Senior Registrar for 9 years and at the Papa Tongariro as Collections Manager of Paintings and Sculpture. He recently completed a 6-year term as Chair of LIAC, which is the Library and Information Advisory Commission, and is also a trustee of the New Zealand UNESCO Memory of the World Trust. He has also been involved in NDF, which is the National Digital Forum, since its formation 20 years ago. So in the queer community, David has been a member of a number of organisations, including 5 years as co-chair of GALS, which is the Auckland Rainbow Choir, and he is a trustee of a Rural Foundation, New Zealand's largest LGBTQI-focused charity. David's presentation this morning takes us back to 2019, when the Auckland Museum developed a Queers Museum audio guide, a narrated walk through the museum's galleries, highlighting objects on display with queer or sex-positive associations. David is going to discuss for us the development of this product and the utility of the collections database for the purpose. Over to you, David.
Very good. Well, kia ora tātou, everybody. So, a queer interrogation, and this is slightly deliberately chosen title because it could suggest in many countries actually police harassment, which still happens today, and it was a sad part of New Zealand and Australia's past as well. But it's not that today. This is an interrogation into the utility of our Vernon collections database for developing a queer audio guide, which we gave the moniker the Queerseum Guide. So Auckland Museum has been around since the 1850s, and it's it evolved through several buildings, and today sits in the Auckland Domain on the hill near central Auckland. It's been on this site since 1929, but in 2013 this happened, and it was the confluence of the museum getting a new LED outdoor lighting system and the rebirth of Auckland's Pride Festival. So we lit up for the occasion and gained enormous media coverage. It hit the front page of the New Zealand Herald paper, and this image was retweeted all over the world. Huge publicity for the museum. But those of us working there had a niggling sense of this, that although it was fantastic publicity, really what was going on the inside? Were we only painting the outside in rainbow colours, but nothing much had actually changed inside the museum? There was a very limited programming that addressed either queer objects or queer audiences. And around this time, my colleague, Director of People and Organisation and in charge of the HR department, put forward a diversity and inclusion policy to our trust board. That then paved the way for us to apply for the Rainbow Tick, the accreditation system run in New Zealand for organisations to recognise good employment practices with regard to their Rainbow Star. But the nagging question still was the defining ingredients of the museum, the collections. Where were they in all of this? So we wanted to develop an audio guide. We thought that was one of the things we could do to highlight what might be in our collections. So starting off, we thought, right, well, what are the ingredients we need? We'll search the database and see what happens. First of all, we had to filter by only the things that were on display. That was easy enough through the location field. We then put in a whole range of keywords. So these ones here: gay, lesbian, queer, homosexual, transgender, same sex, and a whole lot more, just to hedge our bets. And the result was this: absolutely nothing, which was a little disheartening, because we were thinking we were going to clearly have to try a different tack to build our audio guide. Not to be deterred, we thought, right, well, clearly the database is going to be hopeless in this endeavour, so we'll try something else. But around this time, we had built a fairly strong Pride staff group, which was both staff with lived rainbow experience and allies from across the staff. And we teamed up with other museums in Auckland to walk for the first time in the Pride Parade that year. This cohort of staff turned out to be our main ingredient in getting them to identify objects that were on display that they thought would be worth highlighting in our proposed audio guide. We set about with our digital team. So just to outline, this was not an official product from the curatorial team. It was not an official product from our public programs team. This was the Pride group doing a sort of an underground activity and supported by the HR department as a diversity and inclusion activity. We identified our 17 objects initially, set about mapping them where they were in the museum, and so we could start scripting a logical sequence for the visitors to follow. The objects that our staff came up with, so it was around a dozen staff who were involved, and we also each wrote the script and had it edited so it had a degree of cohesion. And then we voiced the audio guide as well. So each stop has a different member of staff voicing it. Typical things like things in our new Auckland galleries, Karangahape Road, the famous red light district, which has got a strong LGBTQ history. We recorded, as I said, each of the stops, our own staff, so you get a different set of voices as you go around. The objects we chose included things like paintings, rugby boots with rainbow laces, which are in the collection, a hermaphrodite snail, sculpture, Egyptian pottery with evidence of male and female use of makeup, the curious case of the endangered kokako, which confounded conservation efforts 20 years ago when the conservation staff were baffled by pairs of birds not producing any eggs. And it was only after a little bit of DNA sequencing that they realised that there was quite a number of male-to-male pairings setting up house, having a good time, but not producing any progeny to contribute to the survival of the species. And things like this, which Korean ceramics, and you might think, well, how are they connected to a Queerseum audio guide? Well, in fact, they were collected by this man, Peter Rule, and he was an Air Force pilot who lost his job through being discovered to be gay. He knew he was gay, but the Air Force didn't, but they found out, and he was immediately dismissed. He later fell into a period of depression. He had a secondary career in arts administration, but eventually committed suicide and left his collection through a roundabout means to the museum. And for Auckland War Memorial, which is also an important part of our building, there's a stop pondering on how many of the soldiers commemorated on the walls might also have been gay or lesbian. So back to the point of why the database was of little use. It got us wondering if what was going wrong here, because clearly there were things on display. So what were the causes of this zero result? Where are the biases in our practice? Where are the blind spots? Where are the things that are actually straight in front of us, but we're just not seeing them? Or are there indeed silences in our collections? We began to question whether the decisions about what gets put on display had inherent bias, but in fact we had found 17 things to put into our audio guide, so that wasn't the case. Are there questions in how things are described? What are the vocabularies that we're using? What are the biases of the people doing that cataloguing work? Are there in fact preponderance of queer-related items that are sitting in the backlog, things that are not catalogued? And it also questioned our collection development policy, and are we being deliberate enough in acquiring things that relate to LGBTI lives? Or in fact, are we asking the wrong question? Are we trying to get the database to do something that it simply can't? Summing up here is we need to think more carefully about what we mean by a queer object. Where does queerness reside? And I would argue that it's not in the objects themselves, but it's actually people, queer people, places associated with queer people and queer activity, queer events in history. So what that leads me to advocate is what we need, in fact, is more context-rich cataloguing. We have to make sure that the objects have a richness around the people, the places, and the events that they're associated with. Because a researcher looking for queer objects is probably going to come at it through a person's name or an event or a place that they're associated with, rather than the object themselves. So queerness could in fact reside in any one of these objects on the screen here, but it's through those associations. And my observation over many years of working in museums and libraries and art galleries is that we can default our cataloguing practice to what's physically in front of us and describe the physical, describe the object qualities. And it's harder to describe the range of contextual qualities, which is actually what's going to be more useful to a range of researchers. Queerness resides in our human history collections most obviously, but as I've shown, there are resonances in the natural sciences and in our documentary heritage collections. Queerness affects the way we collect, the way we document, the way we provide access, and the way that collections are used. We need to think about this when we're entering words and fields into our database. Queerness is everywhere. I like to think that these animals perhaps are on their way to a pride parade. Queerness resides in solemn events too. So Auckland Museum is the host of the largest Anzac Day service every year. Clearly not right at the moment because we have COVID restrictions. But there are queer members in the crowd. There are queer members who we commemorate, and they are not visible at present. So that's the end of my presentation, just to get us thinking about the potential of changing the way we describe collections and thinking about really what are the questions that people are asking when they might be looking for queer content in our collections.
David, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. I think it's also given us a lot of thought into what you were saying about how it's so important that we do note that it's people, places, and events, and not just the objects, because an object by itself that actually says nothing at all. And I also must say that I loved I think it was your first slide one of your first slides where you showed your museum in the beautiful rainbow colours. You know, you also must remember that New Zealand has been such a forefront in LGBTQ relationships, and the introduction to same-sex marriage, was way beyond our time. I think it was 2013 compared to the dismal Australian 2017. And only then it happened because we had a plebiscite, which takes me now to my next speaker for the day. So our next speaker is Erika Taylor. Erika is the acting director of the Tweed Regional Museum and has over 20 years experience working in the glam sector. She is co-curator of Small Town Queer, an online exhibition and collection project that was launched in 2020. And this explores the Tweed's LGBTQ history from the early 1900s to the present. Small Town Queer was awarded the Museums and Galleries National Award for Temporary Exhibitions in 2021. Isn't that fantastic? Erika, over to you.
Thanks, Jesmond. What a great talk, David. And I think you'll find it's so funny. I'm almost giving the same talk on, that small regional scale. All right. So our museum is in far northern New South Wales, up on the north coast. We're considered a regional area, and we're quite small, and we've only got 3.2 full-time employees. And a couple of years ago now, one of our newer employees asked me what we had in the collection that about queer history of the area or anything LGBTQIA+. And, I had a look, and I've been a curator here for almost 10 years. And the answer was, as in David's talk, 0. We had nothing. I think we had one photograph of one man who was he was a 78er, a gay man. That was it. And that's where we started this project. And every time I talk about this project, I start with, it really started from failure. So you look at our mission. Does everyone remember these? You've got them somewhere on your website or hidden in your documents somewhere. And I'm pretty convinced we all have the same. We just reword them so they're, not plagiarizing each other. But, they all say that you're here to, reflect your community about your diverse communities, but we're obviously not doing that, are we? So it was a fail. And it was really important to recognise, just from that one question, that, we had to be better. So Small Town Queer, the idea for the exhibition was born to have a really good look and research the region's queer and contemporary history, but not just a research project, to really look at our practices in the museum to make sure what we were doing was inclusive and reflected our diverse community, because we know we have a queer community here. And we couldn't find their history written anywhere. We also set out to see if we could make any changes on a local government level, where we're local government funded, and we aspired to make a change, see if we could make a change on a national level as well. So the entire project is digital because we have no objects, we have nothing to display. And so we started out as a digital project, so it's online. And it consisted, we wanted to use a range of kind of digital products and play with ways you could access the project. One of the things we used was this really cool story map. And the story map lets us use the geographical map and plot, queer history across the Shire. So, every point you can zoom and you can read a little story from everywhere in the Shire, really, which was something really, really fun. And it's one of the most used parts of our project. We worked with members of the community, kind of participants who we work closely with to write history and research and do certain parts of this project. But we also added a Your Story portal, which is an area on the website where people can add their own story about living in the Tweed and being part of the queer community, which has been a really fantastic interactive part of this project that is ongoing. So people keep adding their own story. You'll see a great story here from Zan, just as an example of living in the area and her little story and history. We wrote kind of research-based essays in several categories: performance in the area, queer icons, really LGBTQIA people who are doing really great and wonderful things in the Tweed region. Women's spaces, there's essays on being queer and Aboriginal, also included in the project. The more we developed it and got into it, we just have this fabulous rich history here. The Tweed is home to one of the first gay communes in Australia, created by some of those 78ers. And you can see some of the wonderful photos we unearthed of that commune. There's a fair bit of nudity on the website, but these photos are a fantastic find. We also looked into the performance history in the area right back to the early 1900s of the travelling shows that would come through, and up to the 80s and the big club shows that happened on the Tweed Gold Coast area, and then right into the contemporary, professional drag queens performing today. And so all up, it was, it's almost PhD worthy. There's 25,000 words of original research going into those stories. We didn't think that was enough, so we also produced our first podcast, Learning Curve. I have some tips if you feel like you're going to do that. And we got some fantastic community members come in and do interviews with us, which we then published on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's just a little 8-part series. And this is a really big deal for us because, as I said, we're only 3.2 people, so we're really kind of stretching our skills here. And these continue to be listened to. We have access to all the analytics. Also on Spotify, we created our Spotify playlist. So if you go onto Spotify and search Small Town Queer, you might stumble across our playlist of songs, which we had a lot of our participants suggested songs, and we got the community to suggest songs and we put it together, and it's really super fun and super eclectic. Yeah, as mentioned, we were awarded the Magna for temporary travelling exhibitions this year, which was a fantastic outcome for this project. And so on another part of the website and another part of the project, we undertook a queering of our museum. If you want to read that text there, we spent a long time discussing the use of the word queer and whether it was appropriate. And so we have justified that on our website, on our project. First up, but I really love this quote we use, that queer people are in museums. They work in them and they visit them, and their stories and objects are collected by them, but yet they are all too often invisible or barely visible. And I think that probably resonates definitely with all the panelists, and probably some of you. Kind of this term queering as well, we explain that to people why we've used it. We've really used it to kind of energise our collection and uncover stories and objects of significance to local queer culture. And so the first thing we did was take a collection survey, a bit like David. You look, what do we have? And we took kind of this theory, it was methodology used in a study 2005 on Victorian collections, and it was looking at those words that might indicate orientation, bisexual, transgender, objects that might be there with association to culture, or objects that might be symbolise part of queer culture. So I like to say our collection was straight and narrow. The history of our collection, being a small regional museum, is collected over 50 years by local historical societies. And, you know, the collection really reflects the people that collected it over those 50 years. Not to stereotype historical society members, but, you know, that an older age group that are usually quite concerned with regional progression and just didn't collect anything outside of that. But then we kind of looked through the collection with that queer lens, as you saw David did with their collections in Auckland. And we discovered some pretty amazing things. And also when we looked through this queer lens, we did it with our project participants and we let them comment on some of our collection objects. So one of my favourites was this 2 photographs, which you see here. And on the back of the originals, it just has handwritten a little story that 2 women travelled in this gypsy caravan from Sydney to our local area during the war, so 1945. And they liked it so much they stayed here for 5 years. And I think the description on the back says 2 friends. And obviously we cannot guess at anyone's sexuality, but that heteronormative way of thinking that these 2 women were friends, there's another, through that queer lens, this story looks different. And it could be used, these photos, to, you know, explore ideas such as Boston marriages, which is when 2 women are living together independent of like men, and all kinds of things. You know, a normative way to look at these 2 women as friends is probably not what was going on. One of our project participants really was taken with this photo because he was just so happy that it was proof that queer people were here for a very long time. And it was just awareness that his community belonged here. This interesting book called The Perfect Woman, which is just kind of typical early 1900s guidebook for women in the home, how to dress yourself, how to clean, how to cook, how to present your hair. But, you know, through that queer lens, is it queer as a juxtaposition? And maybe it could be a manual for someone who identifies as being female or who questions their assigned gender identity, and it could be used that way. A little spicy one. You can even look through a queer lens at, you know, very ordinary objects you have in your collections. Being a regional collection, we have a lot of these things, leather harnesses. This one had no provenance. Assume it's a horse harness, but, you know, harnesses and leather also tell a queer story, don't they? And you can be used that way to tell that story. Another example is a scythe, very common in agricultural collections. The actual provenance of this one was being used on a farm that was known. But it can be used to tell a story as a very strong visual symbol. I'm not too sure if you had this ad in NZ in the 80s, but we had this big ad campaign for HIV in the late 80s featuring, you know, death in robes holding a scythe, and it's a very, very strong symbol. So your humble agricultural slide can also tell a story in that way. Of course, we used the project to start a dedicated queer collection. And through our participants and the relationships we made and our lovely community, we've really started to grow a beautiful dedicated collection. That is a beautiful gown from the Tweed's first professional drag queen, a book from a young queer author, his first published novel, and T-shirts that were used in the marriage equality campaign in 2017, which 2 individuals privately funded in this area. They kindly donated their shirts and a gorgeous little love pin. And so in addition, you know, to all of that, we wanted to rewrite our collection policy, which we did, which was probably the hardest part of the whole project. If you work for a local council in Australian museums, this kind of policy has to go through council and be adopted officially. And so I just pulled out the most relevant bit. Our collection policy really states that we do collect and have specific interest in, you know, that list of people and how they intersect with other themes such as agriculture, shipping, all of those typical historical themes. So that actually took a year to rewrite the collection policy. It had to go on public exhibition. The community had to comment on it, and it had to go to a council meeting and be adopted by all 12 councillors. So quite the process. But we're very glad it's been adopted and is now official. We also took part in programs, this one run from ACON New South Wales, called the Welcome Here program, which you can sign up to get these packs to indicate that people from the queer community are welcome in our museum, which has been wonderful. We have them on all of our buildings. But that's the interesting point. We have these stickers and we might be a welcome space, and staff have gone through diversity and inclusion training, and are you welcome in our database? And then I thought this graphic was very apt. It's like, how do we put this rainbow in a box? Because that's what we're speaking about, is boxes on us, you know, boxes in the database, squares, and lines. For me, this started when one of our participants, I was entering them into the people section of Vernon as a donor of material, and there was no way to reflect their pronouns. And so I simply jumped on Vernon User Group forum and I put a little comment there, could we have a pronoun update in the next update of Vernon? And when you do that, that's how you ended up speaking on a panel about it. I don't have the answers, but we could all get there. Before I finish, I didn't make this up, Queering the Museum or Collection book, and our project is an application of the theory in this book, and we're forever grateful for them for writing it. And I also always give a shout out to the Australian Queer Archives, which are in Melbourne. Just a fantastic organisation. I don't know what the equivalent is in New Zealand. Maybe if there is one, someone could chuck it up in the chat. And that's all I've got. And I'll throw back to you, Jesmond.
Thank you, Erika. That was absolutely fantastic. And I must say, you know, over the last week or so, I was looking at, you know, your website, and I implore everybody participating here today to check it out, because there is a wealth of information there. There's a great read, and there's a lot of stuff there that you just would not believe was going on, not just in Tweed. But what's interesting as well is that, you know, we tend to always look at the major cities as being, you know, the representations of LGBTQ people, you know, and contrary, I remember, you know, Putin saying around 2014 with Sochi gays, you know, there's no gays or lesbians in Russia. I mean, like, give me a break. You know, we are everywhere in the world. And, you know, Erika, your talk just exemplifies such an amazing work that yourself and your colleagues have done. And I really think it's just a fantastic site. And I also love the fact that people are able to get in there and interact with the website themselves. So I look forward to seeing how that site develops in the future. So that takes us now to our third and final speaker for this morning, and that's Emma Neale. Emma joined Monash University Museums of Art as the collection manager in 2019. Emma experienced branches across registration and conservation disciplines, working at the Arts Centre of Melbourne, the Greenwood Centre for Cultural Materials Conservation, University of Melbourne Barrier Library, and the University of Melbourne Archives. So prior to her role at Monash, Emma held the position of coordinating registrar collections operations at the NGV, leading a team responsible for the management of the NGV's permanent collection. Emma holds a Masters of Cultural Materials Conservation degree with a specialisation in objects conservation and a Bachelor of Arts History and Screen and Cultural Studies. As part of the Monash University Museum ongoing efforts to diversify the writings of the collection, 20 LGBTQ identifying writers and artists have been invited to contextualise an artwork through the lens of their experience and knowledge. Reading the works from an LGBTQ perspective is a strategy for intervening in an art historical paradigm, but over the course of history reinforce heterosexuality as the society norm. Emma will be speaking today about the inception of this project and how it's been received and the role of the collection manager database has played. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Jesmond, and thanks, David and Erika, for your presentations. I think we'll see that I'm definitely following the same track as you. So I wanted to let everyone know that my pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners and elders of the lands in which Monash University operates. We acknowledge Aboriginal connection to the material and creative practice on these lands for more than 60,000 years. So I wanted to do a bit of an intro to who we are at Monash University Museum of Art. And this is an image of our gallery space here at Caulfield University. So we are a not-for-profit public art museum located within Australia's largest university. We are part of a network of 22 university art museums in Australia, and we are quite small in size. We have an equivalent of 7.2 full-time staff members, and that is spread over 14 of us, all working part-time. We hold 4 exhibitions across the year on site at MUMA and have quite a busy public program, which of course in the past 2 years has been all delivered online. We are the custodian of the Monash University collection, in which I'm the collection manager. So the collection was established with the opening of the university in 1961 and is distinguished by its adventurousness, commitment to contemporary art practices in all their diverse forms. It includes a wide range of media, including painting, sculpture, photography, to video installations, performance, new media, and public art. MUMA has an ambition to be a museum without walls, to break down borders and barriers that limits accessibility to art and ideas. We have a commitment to contemporary art and to grow and use the collection to actively engage diverse communities in our area. A few stats, because I am a collection manager after all. We have 2,500 artworks within the collection, and 40% of the collection is on display at any time. And this is across the 3 campuses in Victoria and about 70 different buildings. So I'll be talking today about a project that we launched alongside our 60th anniversary program this year. And it was created by my colleagues, Melissa Ratliff, MUMA Curator Research, and Francis E. Parker, MUMA Curator Exhibitions. So we commissioned a group of LGBTQI+ writers and artists to contextualise a selection of works through the lens of their experience and knowledge. And as Jesmond said, it's aimed to diversify the writings on the collection and intervene with this art historical paradigm that really reinforced heterosexuality as a society norm. So they took shape of short form texts and published online and on our socials, as you can see here from our Instagram, and culminates in a display at the library at Caulfield campus. It was originally planned to coincide with Monash University's Diversity and Inclusion Week in September, that we'll now be installing later this month. So the project wasn't posed as a history of queer art from the collection, but to show the collection through the queer experience, looking at tropes and values such as camp, coding, and subversion. And it resulted in a body of works that could be either seen as subversive in themselves or perceived to be subverted. So the texts are publicly accessible now, so I recommend hopping onto our website. They're nearly all up, and will be integrated into our searchable online collection database, which is obviously powered by Vernon. And they will be featured on artwork labels when these artworks return to display across the university, and also included in future publishing of the collection. So I have one example here, Tatsaha by Archie Barry. This work is a single channel video of 4 minutes and 24 seconds and is a new acquisition to the collection this year. Archie Barry is a multidisciplinary artist whose practice spans across performance, video, music composition, and writing modalities. Significantly, their artistic practice is richly informed and complemented by lived experience. The Queer Readings text is written by Marda Spencer-Castle, who is a curator based in Melbourne and associate director at Neon Park. In his text, he describes the works as a depiction of self as a ghostly apparition. The image is literally inverted, rendering the artist's face, mouth, and body in negative. This unfixed, fluid image, the image before its meaning has settled, been defined, or otherwise framed. As a video work, it is situated somewhere between spoken word performance, a music video, and an existential queer manifesto. When roughly translated from German, Tatsache means matter of fact or something that exists. So I have an excerpt here, and please know I've got full permission and consent.
Most of matter is virtual. Most of life is virtual. This body is not real. This body is not fake. This body is not real. This body is not fake. This body is not real. This body is not fake. This body is not real. This body is not fake. This body is not real. This body is not fake.
So Archie's mantra creates a tension between the real and the fake, of knowing and not knowing, and suggests a defiance against the inclination towards reductive categorization. And this resistance to define, name, and categorize is central to many queer, trans, and gender diverse people. Instead of a binary understanding of gender, sexuality, and the body, these positions embrace an openness and mutability. The work suggests that queer bodies and identities are ever evolving and have a multitude of readings, possible trajectories, and realities. As I mentioned, Tatsache was acquired early this year, and Archie advised us of some conditions of the acquisition, which include ongoing consultation in regards to all aspects of storage, preservation, presentation, and public engagement. That they would require a briefing and consultation around any instances of loan and display. They specified it is important that the work is managed by a team who are aware of issues around representation and transgender experience within institutional spaces. And Archie was very open to offering consultation and advice to MUMA in this regard, and future instances of gender diverse inclusion into exhibitions and the collection. So I captured all these stipulations, plus the technical and preservation requirements in our time-based media questionnaire, really for the longevity of the work in the collection. We use this template for video, performance, kinetic installations, etc., and anything that involves time and any consumables such as projectors, sources of power, etc. Accompanying this acquisition, Archie included a copy of the most recent edition of Clear Expectations, Guidelines for Institutions, Galleries, Curators, Working with Trans, Non-Binary and Gender Diverse Artists. And this is co-authored by Archie and Spencer Messer in 2019. And it is written as a non-exhaustive overview of suggested practice, and they recognise that this is really unable to address all situations, as the art world, gender and language are constantly changing constructs. The guide is really helpful in definitions of terms, suggested examples when using gender neutral terms, and recommendations when updating forms and catalogue systems with gender diversity options. So it is available on the NAVA website, which is the National Association of the Visual Arts in Australia. So that leads us to Vernon. And very similar to David and Erika's talk, we actually didn't even hop onto the database at all because we knew that there was nothing that could assist us in our initial search. So the long list selection was really constructed on the knowledge of the curators, Mel and Francis, and of course they spent a lot of time going back historically through the collection. The long list was considered on two main criteria, and that was works by artists who identify as LGBTIQ+, non-binary, gender diverse, sister girl or brother boy, that are terms used in our geographical region by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So obviously we know that this data isn't yet captured on Vernon. The second criteria is that works that materially, formally or conceptually reference queer experience or cultures in an overt or subtextual level, whether or not the work's maker is queer identifying. So there was 148 works that were in the long list, and then the writer selected the work from there. So as I mentioned, we sort of knew that this contextual data wasn't sitting in our system at the moment. And we, I think lockdown one, we decided to put some subject categories in place on all our VI records, and that we're looking at 68 terms that then speak to the subject field search online. And there is a broad category of queer and LGBTQI+ experience, but we're still working backwards through the collection, so it wasn't yet helpful, but it will be in the future. I also just wanted to make a note before finishing up that visibility and representation isn't always inherently positive or a beneficial experience for the artist and should be assumed as such. It can still come at a large personal cost. And an example would be from this project was Juan de Villa's self-portrait of Ingres violin, was selected by the writer Veronica Taylor. And de Villa expressed that he did have a problem with our project and stated to Veronica that it was reductive. He saw it as a form of erasure and censorship even. And he didn't see his work as queer and didn't want to be labelled only as a queer artist. In the end, through a lot of conversations, the work has made it into our project, and the text by Taylor is very interesting in how it sort of traverses de Villa's initial objections. So I think the discussions today in our breakout rooms and back in the larger group will be really interesting in how to brainstorm how this contextual data can fit in with the system and be searchable for future, but also open to a sense of fluidity and inputted with sensitivity and most importantly in consultation with the artist. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was such an interesting presentation. You know, a couple of things I want to just touch base on. In particular about the single channel performance by Archie Berry. And, you know, while that's, a time-based artwork in its nature, the issue that I'm bringing to light is that performance art, which I know that museums and galleries are starting to acquire. And it's something that we also need to think about as collection managers, how to properly define, well, what is a performance art? How do we collect performance collections in our institutions? And how do we document these? But the other thing as well is obviously about the database and, what we are not doing to represent these collections. And, yourself and Erika and David have all touched upon these, which I guess it brings me now to our breakout session. Well, welcome back, everybody. Our breakout session, raised some really interesting conversations and some points that we need to think about in moving forward with this. And maybe either Paul or Lisa, you may want to further clarify the proposed work that we are talking about to enhance the person field.
So one of the confirmed changes in next year's major release is the extension of the fields in the person file to better represent the LGBTQ plus community. And so the proposed changes at this stage are adding a pronouns field, which would be in the names table. So you could, if you wanted, record changes of preferred pronouns over time with dates assigned to that. And that might be aligned with a specific name that person now uses as their preferred name. We want to change the gender field so that instead of it being a single entry, it can support multiple entries, because it isn't always strictly a binary choice. We want to add notes fields aligned to those things so that you can contextualize that. So if you selected a particular category, you could add additional text describing why that category has been chosen. And then lastly, adding a new sexuality field with notes, with again that supporting multiple entries. So that's the proposed changes. That's something where we'll finalise that design over the coming months. We've already had quite a lot of input from particularly some of the panellists today have helped us with that choice of what fields we're looking to add. But as we get feedback after this session and discussion on our forum, that'll be finalised and we'll go into the design for that next version.
So what Paul and his team want to introduce, is a great way for us being able to appropriately, tag people. But what it also does, and it's something that, I'm such a big fan of, is produce accurate data and statistics. When we looked at over the last 20 years of the representation of women in the collection, we all knew that, well, they're not really represented, that well as far as, how many women artists were collecting or how many women artists were exhibiting. But the stats that I was able to produce, I'm clearly proved of that. And it did change the way our executive, our director of collections, viewed those questions. So we did start creating more women artists. We did start creating more, women artists that were Aboriginal to Australia Islander art. We did start exhibiting more women artists. So I think, what Paul is suggesting is a great way for us to move forward. Some of the other things that were raised in our session also talked about, the methodologies, knowing what right methodologies we can use. Obviously, tagging was really an important issue as well. But then we also talked about, well, is it just tagging that we need to think about? For example, if we are purchasing or getting a gift donated to us, when we produce our deed of gift or our purchase agreement, if we're getting a work from either an institution or like a gallery, a private gallery, what we do as well is that the gallery has its own name, yet they also have a legal entity, which is their legal name. And the legal entity, in more cases than not, it's quite different to the name of a gallery. Plus, it also has an ABN number. So what we did was we use the symbolics and we'll be able to create those in the database. And what we have found is that when there is a legal name, as opposed to a preferred name, that legal name and the legal entity will appear on our documents for our purchase agreements, our deed of gift, or anything else. Is there any questions or comments from the breakout session before we move on?
One thing that I was going to add is from our group that there was a discussion about the use of the topic facility within Vernon as a gathering device for various records and various kinds of data that can link around a topic. And what I find particularly attractive about that is that if we have moved from the origin of a lot of our collection databases, which was as registrars and collection managers inventory tools, as in-house tools, to being the generators of the online database, which is principally for another audience, that most of those audiences are actually sadly not interested in the objects first. They're interested in topics, in subjects, in people, in things that have happened in history, in protest movements, in all of those things. So we have to think how we structure the data and what's the weight of data that how much effort we put into the different kinds of data, because actually it's probably the topic that is going to be of some greater utility to export out to the public. And there's a whole lot of sort of data governance and standardization and searchability that needs to be thought about there. But it is shifting our minds, and as a broad group of people concerned with objects, putting our minds in the view of the researcher, the where is the line of inquiry starting, not where is it ending up.
So can I, Krista, I know you're going to hate me. Can I just put you a little bit on the spot, and maybe if you could just share, a story or two that you're working on or have worked on?
So during the first lockdown last year, I wrote a story about our own lung that was built at Auckland Hospital. And that was before we were using topics. So we posted it to Medium blog, and then we got a new website, so we posted it there. And now that we've got it on topic, we can provide more context and there's more browsability into that object and telling more of that object story directly in the place where we're displaying the object online. So we've started using it. I think we've got about 35 topic records on our website now. And those cover the breadth of our departments through library, transport, technology stories. It's been quite a useful file for us to use as well. We have different versions of it as well. For the Medium blog has its own topic record for that object, because it displays in a very different way to how we want it to display on our browser website. So we've called them the A record and the B for browser record. So it's a useful facility if people are looking at using it.
I certainly think that the topic activity has got a lot of power there, and it's something that we definitely need to explore further. And it's funny because I had a chat with my boss about this just yesterday about moving forward with this and how we need a more cohesive plan regarding being able to tell stories and not just throwing out, a whole wealth of items out there. As collection managers, how can we ensure that, the collections and the objects that were once hidden, are collected and displayed respectively? So I was hoping maybe, we could throw some of this question to our panel or to anybody else from attending the session.
I'll just chip in one thing
and
say it's to do, break the silence. I think part of it is ensuring that organisations are fluid enough, and now small organisations do this very well because there's no choice but to have many hands to the pump. But larger organisations can fall into the trap of having very rigid roles and responsibilities and not recognising the cross-fertilisation that can happen. So utilising the skills and the community knowledge or the subject matter knowledge of somebody whose position description might not allow them to have, say, a curatorial input into something, but actually they're a community member who knows a hell of a lot, which is where, just to bring back to the example of our Queer Zoom audio guide, as I said, that didn't have a single curator on the team there. It was the life experience of the staff members from right across the different departments in the museum who contributed to that, and it was there that they chose the objects that resonated for them amongst the 7,000 things that were already on display. So that comfort with letting people range across and outside their job descriptions is one thing. And I know that, some people on the call aren't able to make that change in their organisation, but some of you are. So if you have that agency in your organisation, make sure that it's used, because otherwise you're not using the full talents and knowledge of your teams.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that was such a wordly put together. And I really think that a lot of us that feel that, we may not have a voice, actually do have a voice. And we are the ones at the end of the day who are looking after our database. We are the ones who, are putting in that information. And if the curators are putting in that information, we are all the ones that are checking on information. So it is up to us to be able to, project that further. Erika?
I have mentioned to all of you in our lead-up discussions, and it came up in our breakout group again, the importance of diversity and inclusion training amongst your broader staff. And I think it's easy to fall into a safe little bubble with everyone here today, and I'm sure everyone here, gets it and is, that gets diversity and inclusion, but so many people across our organisation don't, particularly if people are interacting with the database in any way, registrars, assistant registrar, whoever is entering or manipulating data. It's really important for that holistic view. And that kind of training is available online. I know ACON in Australia offer quite cheaply an online module, which is one of the best trainings I've ever done. So I just wanted to state the importance of that again to the broader group.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Erika, for that comment. I would like to thank the three speakers, David, Erika, and Emma, for their thoughtful and enlightening presentations. And it certainly has given us a lot of food for thought and a lot of issues and comments and discussions that no doubt each of us will be having with our teams and moving forward with how we can represent the LGBTQ collections more appropriately in our databases. Looking forward to further conversations with Paul and Lisa about the person file and how we can move forward with this. And I think, at the end of the day, it's good, maybe, we can carry these conversations through the Vernon groups. And I think on that note, I'd like to thank you all for joining our session today. It's been lively, entertaining, and have a happy day.
I want to say thank you, everybody, for listening. It's been really good discussions. And I forgot to mention that our Queersium audio guide is also available via our website. So if any of you are interested, you don't have to be on site in the museum to consume it. So just search audio guides on our website and you'll have a play.
Thanks, David. And before we go, Paul, you had your hand raised. No?
That was just the clapping. That was just the clapping symbol. Thank all the panelists. That's been some great presentations today. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.